what a tremendous pleasure it is to be here in Asheville of the mind from Fairhope, Alabama.
I know. I have to say, Roy, it's when you invited me to be in conversation with you about this book, I really at first thought about the hours that I've spent studying your essays long before you wrote this book. And so it's just it's a delight to be here and to be hosted by Malaprops. So so just thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, we're in a mutual admiration.
Those are the best type of friends, right? Well, I want to just get started in digging into the book and into really what drew, I think, us together besides mutual admiration. To me, one of the things that's most important to your book that we share is this place, Fairhope, Alabama, where I grew up, where you live, and you grew up in Mobile across the bay from Fairhope. So not a long canoe ride, but perhaps a longer drive now with traffic. So I wanted just to start out by talking a little bit about Fairhope as the context for this book. And to me, Fairhope is almost like a character, and it's a prominent place on the cover of your book.
Yes,
when I look at, and I'll just hold this up, when I first got this book, the picture on the front is a picture of home to me. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the cover and about Fairhope as context.
Thank you.
Story.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Essentially, the novel is a story about an 82-year-old retired criminal defense attorney named Hank Weinberger, who wants to spend his mornings fishing on Fairhope Pier. And Fairhope Pier is the closest thing we have to a town square or a piazza or a Zocalo. My book is one of fiction, and yet the settings are often very specific in being real. So Hank is there one early morning with his little 5-year-old grandson and gets word from a young woman who is a kind of a nanny for the boy that her brother is in trouble, accused of a crime. His name is Julio. The young woman Lupita and Julio are from Honduras, and Julio is a groundskeeper at the local fictional resort hotel. Not the Grand Hotel of Point Clear, but inspired by it and those kinds of places like it. And he's in a particular jam because, as it turns out, and you find out very quickly, he's also undocumented. So the story is an old retired lawyer who just wants to fish and a young Honduran who is in trouble, and how the old lawyer is entreated to help him. The other thing that draws the two men together of their different backgrounds is that Hank was a child survivor of the Holocaust. Born in Amsterdam, his family perishes, and he makes his way to Alabama as a refugee, hidden, brought here, and adopted, as it turns out, by family in Alabama. This novel could be set, I guess, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, except for the fishing. It could be set a lot of places in this country. But this is the place that I know well. I'd also lived in New York City for 20 years between growing up in Mobile and moving to Fairhope. So it was a very long way indeed, a long canoe ride, so to speak, before my wife and I and at the time our daughter, who's now grown, but a little girl, came back and settled back here. I've written a lot of journalism set in different places in the world, all over. But when it comes to imaginative writing and personal essays, and certainly fiction, that internal compass that we have, and I know that Mallory, you have it too, always takes me back to not just specifically or only Fairhope, but the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast of Alabama and Mississippi, onto New Orleans, onto the panhandle of Florida. It has to do with the vegetation, has to do with the storms, has to do with the people. It's like a 51st state. And I think that we can probably agree on that. It's dependence on shipping, on fishing, and also its patterns of immigration. So I was looking for a title and for a cover that I felt was appropriate. And this is the hardcover. Mallory showed you the advanced reader copy. And this is a photograph taken by a local political cartoonist, J.D. Crow, who's really quite well known, very nationally recognized, who works here for the Alabama Media Group. But he, living in Fairhope, like all of us here, is completely enraptured by the beauty of this place. And so he takes these gorgeous sunset photos, and I had seen some, and he let me choose one for the cover of the book. Just as a little point of reference, we tried a couple or three of that were really those blood red sunsets that were really deep, but they didn't show up as well with the typeface. And as you know as well, when you look at books now on your smartphone or you're scrolling through, those colors of the blue and the yellow and that pier gave it not only that gorgeous sense of the Gulf Coast, but also, since this is a suspense or a crime novel in a very literary way, it gives it this sense kind of mystery, of almost ominousness, of what's about to come. My working title for the novel was The Cast Net, believe it or not, because it begins with the image of the old man throwing his cast net. And since this is a show and tell, it was in its original form about 800 manuscript pages that I wrote by hand. And you see, I even drew a picture on the front. Can you see that? It says,
yeah.
And as I tell writing students, it's always good to title something when you're working on it, just to begin giving you a focus. And so I generated it page by page, not just in my notebook, but in pieces of paper. This is my new novel I'm working on here, folded up as I go along. So my wife Nancy and I were down at Gulf Shores one day. Many people up in your part of the country know, the Gulf Coast, Orange Beach, Gulf Shores, and we saw this gorgeous V of pelicans overhead, and I felt such a sense of uplift, such a sense of promise and possibility, and I knew that somehow or another that I wanted that kind of almost earthy, tropical but mystical feeling in my novel. And as I began to work on different combinations with the title of Pelican, I hit on the promise of the pelican. And I researched it, and lo and behold, it's a medieval lore that the pelican will pierce its own breast for food to feed its starving chicks if need be. Anything to protect and nurture the young and vulnerable. And that's a very strong theme in this novel. The sense of place makes it very particular, but the title and the storyline, I hope, makes it universal. And that is, we see it every day now with the refugees out of Ukraine with their little ones. The image of the Afghani people holding up their babies to the American compound. Take my child. If I can't go, save my child. Because this is a novel about a place, but it's also a global novel. It's about people from all over the world who meet up here. So Fairhope becomes a kind of a nexus, a meeting point, and Fairhope Pier, which begins as a place just to fish and meander and relax, no charge, open 24 hours a day, suddenly becomes a kind of a radius as well. And when that all came together, I realized that, I had known that I had a novel I was working on. This is my fourth novel, but it helped pull all those strands together. So,
well, for me, starting the book and the Fairhope Pier, like that's my first encounter with home, with also, the pier growing up for me was a multicultural, intergenerational space.
Wow.
Even growing up in the 80s.
Yeah.
Graduating high school in 1984, to be specific. But the pier, it was a place where you'd have, people who were actually fishing for supper. Yes. And then, well-heeled attorneys or folks who had a house at the bay and, another house, at Gulf Shores, taking that stroll up and down the pier.
Yes.
so it was in a strange way, a democracy
Yes,
of place, in a way. So for me, like that opening your book and going straight to the pier where people were fishing, made me feel at home. And Fairhope's not the only place that
absolutely.
has these open spaces, like you said, from Zocolos to piazzas.
Right,
Um,
right.
but it's so interesting to me that you didn't know about. I mean, I didn't know about the pelican and the piercing of the breast. You didn't know that when you came up with the title or the draft title, second
I
title.
I really did not. I knew that I wanted a pelican because it felt right, because of the imagery, because of the scenes, some of the scenes that I had written.
Mhm.
Because even now, when I walk down, there's a marina at the end of our block here, and where you grew up, Mallory, a 5 minutes down to the water. And it just had that feeling of majesty and of possibility. And somehow or another, the word promise came to me, because
Okay.
it's not only the promise of, it's also the promise of the morrow. It's a promise of what
Right.
might come about, of a new day. And and they're just everywhere. And so was it intuitive or just luck? I don't know.
Yeah.
But when I started looking and thinking of the combinations, because when you work on a title,
It's hard.
when you turn it over, and then you sort of do crowdsourcing just with everybody in your family, and everybody said, no, it's like naming a baby or something. Unless you've really got a great family name, you're going to use. Everybody's like, well, that reminds me of this, or no, the pelican, the problem, what is that about? And then, as it turns out, I'm not an ornithologically committed kind of writer. My second novel was called Chicken Dreaming Corn, which was the image from my Romanian Jewish grandparents of, the old expression of the corn, the chicken dreaming of corn, the hopes and dreams of ordinary people, for sustenance, for better life. It's a big theme for me. Ordinary people looking to, particularly immigrants, newcomers, refugees, to establish themselves. So I don't plan on putting a bird in every title. However, there are a couple of owls who've taken up residence out here in our woods. So the Oracle of the Owl, I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I'll say on that is that I think it's so interesting that in Fairhope, one of the sculptures that's quite prominent is of a pelican by
Yes.
Craig Sheldon. And that sense of movement, whereas that idea of refugees, of movement, I mean, the reality too in the Gulf Coast and everywhere is with climate change,
Yes.
movement and is maybe part of all of our lives. And it's just like, who's got the resources to move?
That's a really brilliant comment. And it makes me recall now, and I hadn't even really thought about this, that the pelicans became front and center after the Gulf oil spill, which just walloped us here. And those stories of the pelicans, like other shorebirds who were just coated in oil, and that the naturalist groups wonderfully came and cleaned and tried to restore. And it was so sad and pitiful. They didn't do anything except just fly as they do magnificently and roost. And then, of course, everything it did to the next generation of pelicans. So that really wasn't foremost in my mind, but I guess in some way it sort of was inculcated by that experience too.
Right. Well, I wonder if I want to hear you read, but I wonder if before we do that, do you want to share just a little bit of a overview of the basic storyline of the book, and then we can get you to read a little bit from the start of the book. I mean,
yeah. Well, I set up, I think, the basic premise with the two main characters, Hank and Julio, and I did not set out to write a crime novel, but I knew that there was a crime at the beginning or towards the beginning of the novel, and that there is a trial towards the end of the novel. So some of my writer friends and others began to say, this really kind of feels like a crime novel. And I said, I don't write genre, although genre is perhaps too narrowing a word, because there's extraordinary work being done in crime fiction and every kind of genre that you think of. But I had never written anything that had a kind of an inciting act of violence in it. Maybe it reflects the time we live in, or maybe it was because what could be more contrasting to the beauty of the Gulf Coast or another setting, which is a golf course, which plays into the opening of this novel. What could be more contrasting than that setting and some sort of an act of violence on a random afternoon that cuts across it? And unfortunately, tragically, it's also, I guess, the world that we live in and the time that we live in. Sometimes in the most bucolic places, the worst kinds of things happen. So in as much as it's set into motion by that, it's not only the old lawyer and the young defendant, it's also the daughter of the lawyer, who is an attorney herself in her 30s, Vanessa, who's wrestling with something very different, which is alcoholism, and substance abuse, who's trying to get her act together. And it's her little boy who's been staying with her dad while she is in a rehab facility as an alternative sentencing. There are the other secondary characters. And the other thing is that in as much as Fairhope and the Gulf Coast is really important to me as a setting, there is a lot of backstory in the places that these two main characters were children. Amsterdam in World War II, up until 1942 or 43, when Hank is a 5-year-old, the old gentleman is rescued and brought to America. In Honduras, in the late 1990s, when Julio, as a very little boy, was in a mountainside village that was completely demolished by Hurricane Mitch. And no matter how much you know of the lore of hurricanes in this country, we tend to maybe not pay enough attention in our hurricane history to the fact that it was in Honduras that 11,000 people died in that hurricane. And we saw a similar kind of event not long ago. And it wasn't just so much flooding or even wind, but a lot of it was these mudslides, just burying whole villages. So I had gone down there as a reporter because journalism has been an important part of my career after Hurricane Mitch, and was in that a little village that kind of becomes the fictional backstory of my novel. And so I think we all carry these, what I call the psychology of geography. It's not just where you've come from and not even maybe just where you live, but how many people must there be in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains? And I've been on those trails and love Malaprops, and actually did an event there for Come Landfall, my earlier novel, in person some years ago, but who are carrying other kinds of histories with them, So of either places they were born and grew up, or maybe places that they traveled that moved them in some way. This is the American experience, and not to embrace that experience is to deny the multiculturalism, not just of the US, but of the American South too. Maybe not in greater numbers, but those voices are there as well. Let me just interject by saying that, so I can, for those who are listening in, and to reminisce with Mallory for a moment. I got to know Mallory's work because I knew her wonderful mom and dad and had written about them, and who were environmentalists and naturalists. I mean, the old hippie tradition, the difference being that her dad was like an IBM executive, right? So they were like these kind of superstar, back to the earth, like a CEO types, at least your dad was.
Well, a salesperson. He just sold the computers.
and then when I covered religion for the Alabama newspaper group for a while, I began to discover Mallory's work because of your fine writing about environmentalism and houses of worship, and sort of biblical emphasis on ecology. Right. And so it was both kind of it was a great religion page story about you, because it was not only about the nuts and bolts of houses of worship, whatever the denomination, and what they can do to be ecologically, environmentally good citizens, but also in a very politicized topic. It seems like everything is these days, some of the traditional kinds of Judeo-Christian positions on that. And then, we've kept up ever since. So we come from and have spent much time in the same place, and yet the avenues of our work have varied a great deal, but we also share many of the same sources. So that's what's great about the artistic enterprise, right?
Right. Well, and in reading your book too, and then learning more about your history, I mean, we shared those, like looking at the world through the lens of religion, from my case, from a Christian tradition, from your case, from the Jewish tradition. And then that's a commonality, but then also in reading this book and realizing that your dad was the oldest practicing attorney in Alabama at 97 years old.
Yes,
that
yes.
must have informed your development of Hank as a character, I would think.
Well,
Let me back up. Did that inform your development of Hank?
Well, it's a work of fiction, so the reader knows this because the book is in part dedicated to my dad, to my wife Nancy, our daughter Meredith, my late mom Evelyn, my late dad Charlie, who at that point I say was Alabama's oldest practicing attorney at age 97. Absolutely. It informed not only that, but as with your mom and dad, much about my life. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been in and around courtrooms and I've covered trials some. But I also grew up, and he was old when I was the fourth of the group when that generation where, you'd have kids spread out over 15 years. So my dad was at 43 when I was born. And so to go with him to court when I was older in high school or in college, or to see him with all of his paperwork spread out as he was turning over the possibilities of how to defend a client. And he not just did only criminal, but over the years, civil as well. It did inform me. And I think, Mallory, it's a great question because it informed me in the way that the fiction writer is informed, in an imaginative way. I'm sitting in my house here with lots of art done by friends of ours from around, and you don't see this piece, but a good friend of mine, Bill Pangburn, is an artist from Amarillo, Texas, lived in New York for years. But his work, which looks abstract, is very much influenced by the rivers of his Texas boyhood, for example. In other words, that there are these ways in which, once you begin to work imaginatively as a writer, as a painter, dancer, whatever it might be, you pull these influences in. So yes, there was a certain way of addressing the world, of thinking about defense, of thinking about the specificity of the law and the interpretation of the law that I just picked up,
Yeah.
And I guess that imbued the character of Hank in a way that I wasn't aware of at the time, but that, as you say, is certainly there, So.
Well, why don't you read a little bit for us? Because I would love to. I'm somebody who reads like obsessively nonfiction, and all my fiction writer friends say, you've got to read more fiction to be a better writer. And so it was such a treat to lose myself in the thrill of the uncertainty in your book of what was going to happen. So go ahead, and we'd love to hear some.
Let me just give you a little sense of place to start with. And the novel opens, it's the year 2018, it's October. And then it goes to about 2019 into 2020, just before COVID. And everybody who reads and writes and is aware of this knows that there's a hard stop. Once you get to March of 2020, you've got to write, everything changes, right? So fortunately, I was working on this prior to that, and it's not a COVID novel. So to prepare yourself, in the next year or two, they'll come flooding out, right? The COVID books, but not mine. So that's not the issue yet, but just a little sense of place. So it's early in the morning, and Hank is waking up, and he's waiting on Lupita, who takes care of his little boy, to show up. And Roger has some developmental delays. So you'll get a sense that he's neurologically impaired, who's 5 years old. So he wakes up, and then Lupita doesn't come, and so Hank envisioned the road leading down to the pier, and could smell the mullet. Mullet's a kind of fish. Come on, Roger. He bent down and tousled his grandson's hair. The boy blinked up at him. Graddy, he said. I'm your Graddy, right? Come on now, it's time I taught you something useful. He helped the child dress, fixed him breakfast, and snugged him into a crimson tide sweatshirt. Sense of place, you see. Crimson tide. Know that when we get where we're going, you'll have to stay put, he said. I'm too old to be jumping into the bay after you, okay? Oh, Roger said, and a moment later, grasping Hank's hand. Okay, that a boy, you can help me pull the wagon. He went out to the net hanging dry after he'd run the garden hose after it yesterday to rinse off the brackish bay water, lifted it off its peg and coiled it into the red wagon. Down the lane were Magnolia's canopied Creole cottages, by the porch where the rocker sat empty of his late friend Judge Nikos, toward the bay peeking through the pines where bar pilot navigated a freighter to port. They made their way. They passed the seafood restaurant where his firm held his retirement party. How he'd prayed that Marjorie, his wife, would rally after her stroke and they'd enjoy his new free time together. But that retirement, now in its lonesome fourth year after her rapid decline, seemed to stretch behind him for decades. Behind him as they walked, Roger's little legs moving in a lopsided gait, the wagon bumped and rattled. Through the trees, Hank caught his first glimpse of the pier, stretching out a quarter mile into the water. There was a skein of light over the bay. There it is, Roger. Look, Fairhope Pier. We're going to catch some fish. Fish, said Roger. Yes, fish, plenty of them if we hurry. So during his years practicing law, it says when he would see the old men throwing their nets and fishing from the pier early in the morning, he'd shake his head at the thoughts of folks whose productive lives were over. Now he could not get to his spot fast enough, his heart leaping with the sight of every net spinning out in a golden circle. They arrived at the top of the bluff. The water was slick. Pelicans swooped and plummeted to scoop up shiny Midhaven before flapping aloft again. What a show, he explained to his grandson. They fly together, a family just like us. He started to tell him of the legend that a pelican, if her 6 chicks were starving, would pierce her own breast to feed them her blood, but he didn't want to scare him. They'll do anything for the babies, like I will, he said, like your mommy. She loves you. Look here, said Hank. They got started to the end of the pier. Hank lifted out the ice chest and set it down. Now, he said, we prepare. And this is how you make up a mullet net. How he loved the swirl of the netting rising over his arm. Its folds like Marjorie's skirt slipped off, bunched against the sofa. He lengthened that part of it, making sure the weights on the hem hung free, and trained his gaze on the bay. Even though the sky was cloudless, a patch of darkness moved swiftly over the water as if a fragment of cloud blown across the water were casting a shadow. It's a spirit breathing on the water, he said. The spirit raced back, and Hank rocked back, then forward, letting the net fly. And then he catches the fish in the net, he pulls them up, and his little grandson goes over to one and gets close. Roger bent to the creature, holding a hand out, a tiny finger pointing at the eye of the biggest fish. The mullet gave a violent spasm, flopping up as if it were a flying fish, and Roger was off, his little legs churning. No longer the tyke lollygagging on the walkward, a 4-year-old making a dash for the railing. Up and over it now. And then into the bay. And that's the first scene.
And I know what it's like to be on that pier, and the thought as a mother of having, a child go over the side of the pier.
And then just a little bit of Julio's first chapter.
Yes, please.
So simultaneously, Julio, and they're very short chapters, about 57 chapters, they're 5-6 pages each, some are longer. And it goes from point of view to point of view, third person close, we call it, in the writing business. They're not telling their own stories, but you see the world through their point of view. On the dirt lane behind the small house, Julio moves through the lifting darkness, the blue light of the sheriff's car cutting swatches through the misty dawn. The light from his sister Lupita's room shone like a fading beacon behind him. He had gone there long enough to change his bloody shirt, grab a jacket against the October chill, and somehow lie down and sleep a fitful hour or two. The violence on the 17th green of the golf course, the golfer's white polo shirt turning red with blood, the man's hand twisting toward him, surreal in his head, the grotesque dream that had taken him over and not let go. Why had he thought they wouldn't look for him here? It had been a late afternoon like any other, knocking off at 5 p.m. from his day on the grounds crew at the resort hotel, taking the shortcut by the lush camellia garden that looked out to the sweeping fairways of the hotel golf course, the big oaks casting long shadows like ghosts, stalking the last players scooting by in their golf carts. He was behind his usual schedule. Rather than go by the work shed to leave off his serrated garden knife he carried on his belt, ready for the next morning, he carried it with him. The boys in the Tulane sweatshirts, he'd seen them the day before, stopped him. Hola amigo, one had shouted and waved him over as they stopped their golf cart on their way back to the clubhouse. And then they talked to him in Spanish, and they're golfers and they're being kind of cocky. And then they offer him some marijuana and he smokes it with them, and he knows he shouldn't because, you know, if he's picked up smoking pot, he'll surely be caught and deported. And then they take a selfie with him, right? They say, peace, hombre, this kind of thing, you know. So he sucked on the joint, passing it back and forth. Keep the faith, hombre, they yelled as the cart rolled off. He continued on. Then he heard a voice. Help me. In the encroaching dust, the words had been low and plaintive, coming from the course, and he hurried to see who called out. The golfer alone on the green, holding onto the pin, wavered before Julio, the pot turning the fairway into liquid green that he stopped across. Faster now. There was no one else in the fairways, only the arcing shapes of the trees, wraiths spilling over the sand trap onto the clipped grasses. Help me! The golfer's white polo shirt was turning deep red, the blood soaking the fabric, his red pants like the bright flash of a cardinal that came from the nearby woods. He smelled sweat and grass and the unmistakable stench of whiskey as he came close to the man who uttered, take this, and dropped the bills. And Julio reached out and picked them up. Julio felt himself in the crush of the golfer's embrace, beefy, hot, the man beginning to sag, and it was as though he were being pulled down into the earth. He heard a voice inside saying, run. And he was holding a stranger, sinking down, his face familiar now like other golfers he'd seen liquored up. Run. And then Julio takes the money. He leaves the man who drops to the ground bleeding to death that he's found, and he runs. And that's when the chase pursues him, and the story begins. And Julio is on the pier and then gets word that something's happened to this young man. So rather than begin with a dead body on a golf course, this doesn't give away much, right? Because it's in the first several pages. With who did it, which would be classic kind of, you know, a murder mystery. I begin with the sense of these two characters, the old man on the pier and his concern about his little boy who jumps in. I won't tell you what happens there. And then almost simultaneously, the young man running, first going to his sister's to see if he can find help there or succor there, only when the sheriff comes there. And then the quick flashback of how he got into this predicament of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but also the Good Samaritan, right, who stops to help somebody who's in need, bleeding to death. There's a scene that I won't read, I don't have time, but Hank, as a child Holocaust survivor, visits schools. And when he goes to a school early on, about chapter 4 or 5, it's Holocaust Memorial Day. And as a matter of fact, we have one coming up soon that's international. And he tells the middle schoolers about what happened to him as a little boy. And not only about the horrors of Nazi Germany and his older brother and sister and his mom and dad who were taken away to a concentration camp, but also about the many people, Jews, Christians, men, women, all kinds of people of different backgrounds who helped him escape too, and who, when he came to this country, gave him a new home in Alabama. And then he says, the lesson I want you to know, and it's a big theme in my novel, and I know, Mallory, it's one that resonated for your mom and dad and for you too, is he talks about how important it is to come to understand people who are different from you, not to demonize the other, not to begin with a prejudgment about people who are different. And it's not meant to be a political novel overtly, and yet it's a strong theme of these people of different backgrounds who get caught up in the web of this cast net. So maybe that could have been an alternate title, but who also, in the promise of the Pelican, do what they can to help each other and find their way through. So.
The themes are so relevant to everything that's going on in our world. I think that's to me one of the takes home is it's fiction, but as I'm reading, I'm thinking of our world right now and the importance of that.
I appreciate that.
We do have a question that I'm going to read in just a sec, but I just wanted to, one of the last questions I had that's related to the scenes that you just described with Hank in the schools, as well as Julio on the golf course. There's been a lot of just coverage, it feels like, with about this issue, and you've talked about it in interviews about like cultural appropriation, or how do you write about characters that come from a different background as you. And so it was funny. I read a quote from Ann Tyler, who's a well-known novelist, who says essentially it would be foolish of her, she writes, to like write a novel from the perspective of, for example, she says, a Black man, but I think I should be allowed to do it. And so I'm curious if you could just share with us how you approached writing from these very different points of view and backgrounds, just from your perspective as a fiction writer.
Well, I appreciate that question. It's certainly one that keeps coming up, only because it's a question that is, runs through, courses through our society now. And I was actually on a panel at the Tennessee Williams Festival in New Orleans on this very topic. When I write about characters of different backgrounds, and I'm willing to take that risk as an artist, because I think it is important. Because, as Eudore Welty said, there's never just a character alone in a room. That's not a story. The story begins when there's a knock on the door. So if I were to subtract Julio from this story, then, it would miss a kind of way that also helps tell the story of Hank. So he's essential to the story. I have only written about people of different backgrounds when I have done some body research. The novelist Sina Jeter Naslund, who is a friend and great inspiration to me, uses the term body research. And, having been to Central America, having learning pretty good Spanish, having tried to listen to stories, tried to understand as much as I could of what the experience is of the newcomer to this country, even tapping into being the grandson of immigrants to this country. None of that makes me an authority to write a book of history or sociology or cultural analysis, but it gives me, the question then is, in as much as I can gather a certain amount of information about somebody of a different background, what is the way in to that character? Because after all, you can have identical triplets who are so different and don't even understand each other, or people who are very much like you, and you say, I have no idea what that guy's thinking, the guy next door, for example. So I'm creating characters who I feel I've got some sense of connection with. Having been to that particular village where he was as a boy, even though it's fictional, was a way in. The interior life of this young man who also, once he becomes incarcerated, waiting a trial, has a religious sort of journey of his own, from a very traditional kind of a Catholicism that his mother is steeped in, and she's a very, religious and very conscientious woman down in Central America. He sends money to a more ecstatic kind of evangelical isn't the word, but a kind of almost this religious fervor that he gets when he's in jail is something that, having written about religion and having been in all kinds of different churches and such, it wasn't that I took A and put it in B. It's not like a chemist, but they were like little ways that it was like maybe like climbers get a little edge and then they're able to move to the next place or something like that. So there were little ways that gave me kind of an insight into who he might be. So it doesn't mean that I'm an expert on those qualities of him that are Honduran, but maybe I tapped into him as somebody, a man in his late 60s now who was once in his 20s. So I think one of the perils of artistic restraint and not writing about people of different backgrounds is that we can sometimes let identity be top heavy, because you can meet people. Just think, when you travel, you might meet somebody of an entirely different background, but somehow you just connect and have fun, or you have a drink or a cup of coffee. And that's kind of the mystical sense. So I try to find characters. I have to find characters who I can connect with in that way. And I've also written in Come Landfall, the story of the secondary characters were Southeast Asian refugees, in particular a daughter of Vietnamese shrimpers. When I was a reporter here in Alabama, I spent a lot of time down by La Battery, Alabama, working with and talking to the children of the boat people. I just needed one story, one way in. It's not a kind of conviction on my part. It's just an instinct. And this is also the South that draws me, and the South that I love. I lived in New York City for years and years and still love the big city with people of all kinds of different backgrounds. And I can feel immersed in and swept away by somebody else's culture, just through whatever their celebration might be, or going into their church. And it's not mine, but their culture. And yet when it comes to my characters, I feel that I can pull from people all over. And I like Ann Tyler's comment. And so that's what I've done. And good, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's been important to my story. And of course, for every character that I write about it who's not me, I hope that 50 or 100 or 1,000 writers of that particular culture write their stories and write their novels, and make somebody like me a character. That's what we've got to move to, and I think we will as time moves on.
Well, and like you said, I'm going to make sure we have time. We've got a question up here that I want to read. But like you said, that's the spaces in which we are living are multicultural spaces. So the stories, and I think that's the stories have to reflect that on some level. I want to make sure we get to a question from folks who are listening, and it relates to your writing and the plethora of genres, non-genres in which you write. Pat Hudson from Knoxville asked, can you write nonfiction and fiction at the same time? Like, are you able to bounce back and forth, or do you have to focus solely on one at a time?
That's a great question. I know Pat, and I also know that she has a first novel coming out soon. I think it's her first, by an independent press, edited by Silas House, a wonderful Kentucky writer, I recall. And if it's not the right Pat Hudson or Patricia Hudson, then I've given someone else, another Patricia Hudson, the visibility that she deserves. I think that the mind is and the talent is capable of all kinds of things. I have certainly worked as a nonfiction writer. It's easier to make a living as a nonfiction writer I've worked as a journalist. I've worked as a speech writer. I've done my share when I lived in New York City, you know, to pay the overhead of some behind the scenes writing and this kind of thing. I mean, you know, having done a corporate board report when I was, you know, 35 with a little girl and, you know, an apartment in the village and my wife teaching, that didn't hurt me, or having written speeches for university president or for state governor. If anything, I think that, and I was always working on novels. And what's really been important to me has been the pen and the page. And Pat, if it's of any help in terms of being a practical sort of direction here, I find that I tend to do a lot of my imaginative writing by hand, and I tend to do it anywhere. I don't feel like I need to be sitting in front of the computer screen, in front of the keyboard between the hours of, you know, X and Y. Of course, then again, I have a much looser schedule than I did at earlier times, you know, right now. But and then when it would come to my nonfiction or certainly journalism, you know, I would sort of tee up, you know, in front of the screen. I would have my files and I would go into that head. So I don't think you can do them like simultaneously, but I think you can devote part of your day to each, you know? I really do. But the other thing that's so important in writing is to be attuned to whatever your own creative process is, right? So, I mean, in teaching and mentoring, you know, I've worked with nonfiction writers who are just like so much want to write imaginatively, but they just can't figure out how to make stuff up and feel good about it, you know? And then I've worked with fiction writers who seem to be, I don't know, have so many great real stories to tell, you know, that sometimes you have to find whatever the best way of doing it is for you. I've just done both since I've been a teenager. I mean, I really have, you know, and it's been natural. So yes, you can. And I think that it's not better or worse. It's not a requirement. And the other thing is that if you know all of my work, or you get to know all of my work, or much of it, a lot of it pulls from the same well or similar wells, you know? So I do think in that way, you know. So any other questions?
I wonder what's the name, you recall the name of the Silas House's press?
I don't. Maybe Pat could.
I can look it up. Yeah.
I'm not even, I think it's brand new, you know, so maybe Pat could send you a note on it.
Okay, well, when I can look it up too. Well, congratulations to Pat. Yeah, I don't know if we have any other questions in the couple of minutes that we have left, and I certainly can. I've got questions to queue up for sure, but if we have any more, and it seems like we might not have any more, so I wonder. We've got a couple of minutes left, and this is another just question that has come to me, is that I think a part in your book, to me, another theme was like, how do we stay in touch with those who have died?
Wow.
That mean something to us.
Mm-hmm.
And where that resonated with me is Hank and his kind of conversations with Marjorie.
Yes.
And that was just a touching part to me that wasn't a central theme, but it was one that it resonated with me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's one of those things that sadly, but inevitably, we have to learn with time, right? As we move through our lives, you know, your wonderful mom and dad, for example, you know, and I really, you know, it's important in my work, and no matter what the subject matter is or the drama that I'm exploring, connection is really, really key to me. Characters who ultimately try to find each other by the hardest, whatever their different backgrounds are, whatever their different, you know, ethnicities or identities or and that connection across generations. And now that you say it, again, a really wonderful and sensitive comment, that connection to the past. So when Hank walks on the pier, he also sits on a bench with Marjorie's name, carved into it. As we see these, I'm sure all around Asheville, that somewhere they're probably memorial benches or stones or something, and somebody has paid so much and has this memorial bench, and he sits there and he talks to her, in his mind, and puzzles over some of these things that bother him. So she becomes a character as well. So each of us brings not only our own history with us, but this whole wealth of characters with us. So that's really important, and it informs my work a lot,
Yeah. Well, I'm just, so grateful to have had the chance to talk and just to be here with you in Asheville. And then I hope you can come visit sometime again in person. And I'm grateful to everybody who's been here with us on the, to join in the conversation. And Patricia did share as well that Silas House's press is Fireside Industries, which is the fiction imprint of the University Press of Kentucky. So for now, we'll turn things back over to Stephanie to wrap us up.
Terrific. Thank you, Mallory. You've been great. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just popping in to say, pardon my computer, just bumped it there. Just popping in to say thank you to you both. I really enjoyed your conversation. Roy, congratulations on the new book. And Mallory, it's always great to see you. I'll remind everyone and encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Promise of the Pelican from your local independent bookstore, and also Our Last Best Act from your local independent bookstore. And if you're here in Asheville, we hope to see you in the store, and we thank you all so much. Thank you both again, and thanks to everyone who's been with us.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.